Hi, TheHande here. So some while ago, I made a video talking about forgotten and obscure video game mascot characters. And in that video, I mentioned that some of these characters were the byproduct of the 1990s video game mascot craze, which took place thanks to the release of Sonic the Hedgehog. In that same video, however, I mentioned that the 1980s had its own slightly smaller scale mascot craze. And this got me into thinking that I actually kind of wanted to make a video just discussing 80s video game mascots. Also, just speak about why quite a lot of the 80s video game mascots have kind of disappeared into the ether, while others have had sustained success even much later on. Now, of course, all video game mascots are not created equal. Mario has been around for quite a while, and Mega Man had a good long run before that series eventually fell into obscurity. But there are others, even relatively iconic 80s video game franchises that maybe are no longer really as relevant as you might think. So in this video, I'll be talking about 4 mascot characters, specifically Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, Q-Bird, and the dinosaurs Bob and Bob from Taito's Bubble Bobble. And let's start with Donkey Kong. Without question, Donkey Kong was one of the most iconic video games of the early 1980s, and it is the game that is responsible for making Nintendo the giant and important video game company that it is now known as today. Now, Donkey Kong Jr., the sequel to Donkey Kong, was also extremely successful, but after this point, the timeline of Donkey Kong diverges into 2 separate paths, one dominated by Mario, and the one following the titular ape. By the 3rd game, both Mario and Donkey Kong were actually starring in their own games, and unfortunately for Donkey Kong, he was a bit of a victim of his own success, as his 3rd game appearance, Donkey Kong 3, failed to reach the same kind of heights as his first 2 appearances. Whereas in stark contrast, Mario continued to enjoy more success, with Mario Brothers coming out roughly around the same time. Now, I need to stress that the arcade Mario Brothers was not like a massive success, but it and the original Donkey Kong were still constantly being ported to new systems, even as the console industry was in dire straits. By stark contrast, the character Donkey Kong seemed to have been kind of pigeonholed into the iconic image of broken scaffolding, so much so that even his first appearance on Nintendo's own console was just a port of the original Donkey Kong. Nintendo had a few efforts of trying to reinvigorate the character, but it really took until 1994's Donkey Kong Country, which was developed by Rareware, before Donkey Kong really began to reach new heights again. Donkey Kong Country was then followed by 2 extremely successful sequels, and it seemed like the character really had managed to recapture the imagination of the gaming public. But then Donkey Kong had its next unfortunate misstep, and that happened in the aftermath of Donkey Kong 64. First of all, DK64 took its sweet time to come out. It was really one of the final big games on the Nintendo 64. And after this, there would be no new 3D Donkey Kong games, since Rareware ended up being bought out by Microsoft, and Nintendo didn't really see fit to bring Donkey Kong back in a proper game appearance until the Wii era. By which point, Donkey Kong had kind of been relegated into a decisive B tier as a franchise. Like, don't get me wrong, Donkey Kong definitely has a much easier time than, say, Star Fox, but DK is definitely not a priority franchise with Nintendo. But nevertheless, thanks to Donkey Kong Country and Rare's redesign, Donkey Kong has definitely enjoyed a much more graceful later years than some of the other characters I'm going to be talking about in today's video. Next up, Pac-Man. After Donkey Kong, Pac-Man is the 2nd most iconic character of the early 80s, developed by the video game company Namco, with Pac-Man's design immediately popularizing the genre of maze games. You need to remember that during this time, video games were very simple, and so when somebody came up with a very good idea, it would get copied like hundreds and hundreds of times. Now, unlike Donkey Kong, however, Pac-Man actually managed to have sustained success in multiple different forms throughout the following years. People obviously know about the 2 iconic Pac-Man maze sequels, Ms. Pac-Man and Pac-Man Jr., but then there was also Pac-Land, which I was actually a little bit unaware of, and this actually did transcend Pac-Man into new genres. I was actually a little bit surprised to find out Pac-Land is even cited by Shigeru Miyamoto as being a major influence on Super Mario Bros. So it's fair to say that Namco really milked Pac-Man for all it's worth. Pac-Man was also the first video game character to have a cartoon based on him, so the 1980s was a great time for him, and Pac-Man remains very iconic today, thanks in part to his simplicity. I mean, the character design is literally based on a pizza. But I would say that during the 1990s, Pac-Man really kind of fell into more of an ornament of Namco than a legitimate successful game series. Don't get me wrong, Namco has never stopped making Pac-Man games, but they have definitely become much rarer and more infrequent as game releases as time has gone on. Like, Pac-Man remains a beloved icon of the franchise, but since the 1980s, there really hasn't been what I would consider a notable shift in the franchise. But much like Donkey Kong, I think Pac-Man has still had a very graceful later years in the video game industry. It's just that nobody really gets like super excited to see a new Pac-Man game anymore, though they certainly do sell well enough to sometimes warrant occasional sequels and what have you. Next up is Q*bert, who is the very strong third place runner for the most iconic and most merchandised video game character of the early 80s. Q*bert was a really bizarre little title, in a genre that even defies explanation. I suppose you could call this the tile coloring subgenre, but indeed, Q*bert was a huge success during the early part of the 1980s, and I was even surprised to find out that Q*bert's various sequels also attracted a lot of positive attention, especially when you consider that Q*bert is the first video game character to swear in video games, which I suppose is appropriate considering he's also the first truly successful American-created video game character. However, Q*bert's successes, much like Pac-Man's, would not transcend the 1980s, and this was not due to the games becoming less popular over time, but rather because the company that made Q*bert ended up leaving the video game industry. That company being the arcade operator Gottlieb. Gottlieb was technically under the ownership of Columbia Pictures, and after they were bought out by Sony, they have continued to be Q*bert's owners, and while Sony has certainly released a few Q*bert video games over the years, they have not really innovated the character in any meaningful way. And I guess that's kind of to be expected when the company that creates you no longer is the one that actually is looking out for you. Q*bert has had a few occasional pop-ups here and there. For instance, people might remember that he showed up in the Adam Sandler movie Pixels, and also had a cameo in Disney's Wreck-It Ralph, and his role in Pixels was actually quite substantial. Unfortunately, I think his appearance in Wreck-It Ralph was actually kind of sad because it kind of banked entirely on the fact that Q*bert is a character that barely anybody remembers. And that's sad because Q*bert is definitely quite an unusual title, to say the least, and personally one of my favorites from this era. And lastly, Bubble Bobble. Bubble Bobble was one of the last really big arcade hits of the 1980s as far as mascotable characters is concerned, if that is even a verb. The dinosaur characters Bob and Bob became huge hits, and Bubble Bobble basically got ported to every system under the sun upon its release, easily making it Taito's most successful arcade game since the original Space Invaders. So you might be a bit shocked to find out that for some reason Taito did not see it fit to have Bob and Bob appear at their original form in the game's sequel, Rainbow Islands. Now, some of you might be even a bit surprised that Rainbow Islands is a sequel to Bubble Bobble, because a big twist at the end of Bubble Bobble was that the dinosaur characters were in fact not dinosaurs at all, but actually human children turned into dinosaurs by the game's villain, which is why in Rainbow Islands the now reverted Bob and Bob appeared as human characters. Now, to be fair, Rainbow Islands was actually a commercial success in its own right, and did lead to sequels as well. But I think Taito realized a little too late that they had maybe squandered the cuteness factor of Bob and Bob, and why their subsequent sequels, while still commercially successful, they maybe missed the boat a little bit on these characters, and maybe slightly squandered their success. Now, Bob and Bob did sort of have a revival in the mid-90s as well, although ironically through a completely different series. In the mid-90s, Taito released the Puzzle Bubble games, which were released internationally under the rather confusing title of Bust-A-Move. And in these games, in order to liven up the visual appearance, Taito decided that it would be smart to use the Bubble Bubble characters. Puzzle Bubble became hugely successful, in no small part because of the puzzle game craze of the early to mid-90s, but I have noticed that over time as the series went on, Taito actually started to kind of phase out the Bubble Bubble characters in favor of their own original and far less memorable characters. Now, that is not to say Bubble Bobble or Rainbow Islands has ever really truly disappeared. Taito continues to release Bubble Bobble and Rainbow Island games to this very day on various systems, but I think this is unfortunately a symptom that we kind of see also a little bit with Pac-Man and Q*bert. That is to say that for some reason Taito has never really able to build on the original concept of Bubble Bobble that much, and this is why all their new games are basically nothing but rehashes of the old format. Now, some of you might be saying that this is a bit hypocritical when you stop to think about that Nintendo's Mario continues to have 2D games based on it, and I will agree that some people might find Mario's design a little bit outdated at this point, but to be fair, Nintendo has always made some new innovations with Mario. It's just that a lot of them at this point are a little bit more subtle because it's kind of difficult to reiterate on a genre that is this old and dated. And I am a little bit surprised that Bubble Bobble is a franchise that is going on nearly 40 years at this point. And as far as I can tell, Taito has not even entertained the idea of maybe upgrading Bubble Bubble to 3D or something like that. But maybe I'm speaking too soon and a new 3D Bubble Bubble is just around the corner. That kind of stuff has happened to me before. But anyway, I hope that you found that this little info packet on these 80s video game mascot characters somewhat interesting, or at the very least educational. Tell me, are there other 80s video game mascot characters that might be worth talking about in a future video? And which of the mascot characters and their games are your personal favorites? You can leave those in the comments. I'm TheHande. See you on the next one.